Hi, this is Joe Avati and welcome to Church Street Studios, my Sydney studio where I record my podcast, A Serious Chat with a Comedian. Well, I'm very excited to be speaking to my guest today. She wrote the book Looking for Alibrandi, and of course from there came the wonderful film. She's written many books, children's books, fantasy books. She's an award-winning author. Ladies and gentlemen, let's go and meet Melina Marchetti. Melina, thanks very much for joining us. So your writing career started in 1992, right, when you wrote Looking for Brandy. But what led you to that process? What when you were a girl, did you always know you were going to be a writer? Did you love writing, or did it come later on in life? Tell us about that.
Well, it's interesting because I always say my published career started in 1992. And the thing that I think people don't understand, which I kind of like, is that I didn't have that background at school where, teachers went around saying, oh my God, she's going to be an amazing writer. I really struggled at school, and I was a late reader, and I always loved the fact that my mother really got herself involved. And I remember being in first grade and I couldn't read, and it was at a time when there were like 40 kids in the classroom and most of them came from non-English speaking backgrounds. And my mother's thing was, why did my older sister and my younger sister, who hadn't even started school, why could they read? I couldn't. And so she came to my school for the next 5 years every afternoon and helped the teacher in first grade, teach kids how to read.
Yeah.
And I feel as if that was done because of me, for me. And as a result of that, I was just such an avid reader. And what I found, and I think what a lot of us find at that time, is that every time I read a book, I didn't see myself in the pages of that book. And I always think that...
Well, what did you see?
I saw Anglo kids. I saw kids from America, from England. I saw middle-class kids. I didn't see working-class kids from the inner west of Sydney who came from an Italian background. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, I just felt, I think a lot of us feel this way, that if we don't exist outside our immediate family and our school, then we're not important enough. So I think it came from that. And I always say this, that you don't dislike the people doing that to you. You kind of dislike yourself in a way. It's almost like you're not worthy enough. But I was just an avid reader. And I always think that that's probably what got me to the point of thinking I could write. But I left school when I was 15 and I didn't go to uni until I was 25.
What did you do in between that?
Well, my mum insisted that because I was such a young 15-year-old, just young in maturity in, the world. Mm. Could you imagine, coming from this incredibly, I suppose, strict family, but not because of the Italian side. Yeah. My mother was, raised by the Irish nuns in Queensland, so it was really the Catholicism that was such a big influence in our lives. So she sent me to business college to learn how to type. And it was back in the day where there were no there were no computers.
No, of course, the typewriting was a course.
I know.
Right? And I think we should clarify that, your mum, even though you've grown up as in an Italian household, your mum was actually born in Australia, right?
Yes, I'm kind of a result of pre-World War II migration and post-World War II migration. So my nonno from my mother's side came out in the 1930s and my dad came out in 1956. So my mum, I love the fact that she was just such a, I suppose, in her own kind of small world in, country town, North Queensland. She had a job with the union. So whenever someone, we used to call them off the boat, used to come in, she had to go and register them. And that's how she met my father at the age of 17. So, and it was a love story, it was such a, but I really felt that growing up, and my sisters as well, there was something different about us because of the pre-World War II, post-World War II, and also the fact that we had a mother who came from North Queensland, which is an interesting part of the world.
Whereabouts, Mareeba?
No, Ayr.
Oh, so, Ayr, yeah.
So she was originally, she was born in Halifax, but they came down to Ayr when she was about, I think 8 or 9.
Yeah.
And that's where, every second year of our lives we spent in Ayr. And that was just such a big, I suppose, we felt very defined by that. And she certainly is very much a Queenslander, even at 82 today. So yeah, it was just more of, she made me go to business college, which I think was a good thing. And the best thing about it was I really struggled with my handwriting. And so if I wrote a story, I could never read it back. I couldn't read back my own handwriting. So learning how to type was just like this incredible release. And I'm just such a tasker when it comes to even today, because they'd cover our hands so that we wouldn't look at the key. So I'm pretty fantastic at being able to, type. And
how do they do that? How do they, what?
it was just a piece of cloth that you used to have to put your hands under so that you wouldn't look. So, so we were fast and still now.
Yeah.
And I found that when I was teaching, it was just amazing to be able to whip something up in 2 minutes and still be kind of telling off all the boys, so and that's pretty much how I got to read back my own writing.
Yeah, I think that you make an interesting point there, because I found as part of the creative process, I had to do a TV show one day. It was actually the Footy Show, I think it was, back when the Footy Show was big, but they wanted me to type out my set. They wanted to know word for word what I was going to say. I'd never done that before. In the process of actually writing out my gags, I started writing extra bits to it.
Yes.
Because of that whole the process of that. So it's very interesting that you say that too. Now, going back to what you said about your mum making you read and becoming an avid reader, because I think it's important for people listening, because some people think, oh, geez, you would have had to be a reader from when you were young, you were fantasizing about stories and, started writing, and you didn't. So how old were you when you actually started
I was
to
still,
write?
I was still young, but I have to say that I had movies in my head all my life. It was just, I've always had obsessions with movies, and of course we didn't go to movies a lot. We went to the drive-in.
Yeah.
I remember seeing Jungle Book at the drive-in, but they were movies in my head before they were written down. And I remember distinctly when I was at school, I think I was in year 9, and I wrote a piece that I thought was pretty funny, because we had to write, satire. And I thought it was funny. And I remember when the teacher was reading them out, she said they were all bad, and I'll give you an example. And she used mine. And my work had never been read out. So to be read out when I thought it was great, as a bad example. But when I was walking out the classroom, someone stopped me and said, that was pretty funny. And it was the first time, that was my audience. That was my very first time that I realised I could write something that was entertaining to someone. And that's important. Knowing that you've got an audience is pretty important.
And how old were you then?
I was about 14 then.
14, yeah, right.
So when I was at business college, when I was 15, 16, I was writing a story. I was writing a novel. Back in a day where people weren't writing novels, about a 17-year-old girl. I remember her name's Genevieve Tyson, because I sometimes use it as a fake name over the phone. So Genevieve Tyson, 17 years old, lived in Kiama, hung out at the beach, during her HSC year, and didn't have a dad. I remember that. And I had never been to Kiama in my life, but it was back in the day when there was a tourist bureau, and they used to send me, pamphlets, and I knew every street in Kiama and didn't end up going until about 10 years ago. So I realised then that I was writing about something I wasn't really familiar with, and we're always told write what we know. But the other thing that was happening at the same time, and I don't know if this happened to you, no, I think I get a sense that you had a great sense of who you were here, but because we were between kind of two cultures, I never felt that I belonged to the Aussies, and I never felt as if I belonged to the Italians.
Exactly.
We didn't. My Italian wasn't good enough because I was a late speaker.
Yeah.
It wasn't good enough, and if you didn't speak Italian, then you weren't one of the cool Italian girls. And if you didn't look like an Aussie girl, you weren't one of the Aussies.
Yeah.
And someone said to me, as soon as you go to Italy, you'll step off the plane, and they'll just all come to you, and you'll think, this is where I belong. And that didn't happen.
Yeah, right.
And I was 19, but I did stay with my great aunts, and all the stories they told me, it was just amazing, because this was in the 80s, and they could still remember crying their heads off when my grandmother and my dad and his brothers and sister left in 1956. It was like it happened the other day.
Yeah.
And that stayed with me, and it was when I came home from that trip that I started writing.
Yeah. But I don't know if you have this experience. Every time I go to Italy now, There was a time when I used to go, and exactly what you said, I didn't feel Italian. I didn't feel Australian. So who was I? And I think that, your work and my work, I know, it gives people a sense of identity. And when you can give someone a sense of identity, that's very powerful.
It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
I think it's one of, it's one of the most important things, especially in this country, because I think that everyone has an issue with identity, whether you're Italian and told you don't belong here, or whether you're Indigenous and it was taken from you, or whether you're Aussie and you're constantly told you stole it from someone else. So everyone's kind of grappling with this thing of identity. And you get to a point where writing that novel was important for me because I understood where I belong. But I agree with you that what you talk about, what I've written, I don't find that my nephews who are 21 and 19 have an issue with identity in this country, and they're half Irish. Their dad is, Dublin born, but I've never seen them they've grappled with a lot of other things, but not with culture. And I think we did all the hard work.
We were the experimental generation. They experimented on us so that they can have what they have today.
Yeah, I just hope that they realise, because I think it was a big deal in my day, and I'm older than you, but I distinctly remember the racism in the 70s and 80s in a way that, my nephew's girlfriend, for example, will say she read Alibrandi for the first time and said, I didn't realise, it was that bad, because she was raised by Australian-born migrants, whereas we were still kind of at that cusp in between.
Yeah.
So,
but when you go to Italy, I don't know. At first, I felt more Italian, and then as I matured and as I kept on going to Italy, I felt every time I went, I felt more and more Australian.
Definitely, because if someone asks you what nationality you are here, without being like sometimes people used to. I wrote about it so much, with Alibrandi, it'd be like, well, you're Italian, or no, you're Australian, whatever. But if someone asks me that, here, I know what they're asking. They're asking what my cultural background is.
That's right.
It's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Whereas if someone asks you that in Italy, because they hear that you're speaking English, well, it's a no-brainer what they mean. So you have to adapt yourself, to the situation. I don't ever get offended, when people want to say, well, why did you ask? Because I'm Australian. And I think, well, what we're asking is where do you come from culturally? I'm always interested in that, but I make sure that I word it in a way that I don't say to someone, where are you from? I say, what's your cultural background? And that's where you can get a response from them.
Well, look, obviously your breakout move was looking for Alibrandi. You wrote the novel first, which got adapted to a screenplay, and both was very successful in their own right. And now we're celebrating the 30th anniversary, right?
Which makes me feel very old.
But, but you're wise. Okay. Tell us about how it happened. Okay. For those people watching and listening, firstly, tell us, about the movie, and then tell us how you got to write it and why you wrote it.
Well, I suppose I have to start with the novel. So I stopped writing about the girl who lived in Kiama and started writing about the girl who lived in the inner west of Sydney. And it was writing, I knew three things when I was that age. I knew only three things. I knew what it was like to go to an all-girls Catholic school. I knew what it was like to live in Sydney, and I knew what it was like to come from an Italian family. And that novel is just about all those three things. And then, of course, I changed things because I came from a very traditional family. I've got two sisters. Mum and Dad, were married until my dad passed away. Whereas with Josie, I made changes because I needed conflict. I needed more conflict. And I needed actually the type of conflict that Aussies would understand as opposed to just Italians. So I wrote the manuscript, sent it off, and it got rejected. And I kept on fixing it up and sending it off, and it got rejected. And it probably would have got rejected about, 6 times or so. And then it was finally published or accepted probably 3 years before it came out. So there was a lot of work. By that stage, I was at university. But it came out in 1992, and it was in 1993 that someone approached me about the film rights. And I have to say I wasn't jumping for joy because I was so worried about how Italians were. I mean, you know how Italians were depicted back then. They were either crooks or, you know, it was stereotypes. It was awful. So I was very, very possessive about it. And I had my mother in my ear saying, don't make us look bad. You know, it was that sort of thing. So I felt as if I had a lot of responsibility. And it kept on failing as a script. And then they finally came to me and said, you know, your dialogue's really strong. Would you be interested in writing the film script? And you're always told as a prose writer that you're not a good script writer. But I just went with it. And I was very lucky. I was with people who I felt quite looked after. And although it just took years and years to get this script right, because it's very difficult to put a 276-page book into a 90-minute film, I think the beauty of that film was the script definitely, but it was also the casting, which I think was just spot on.
Yeah. Let's just take a step back there, because I think that's an interesting process. So, you know, how do you start? You know, you got your book, you know, obviously, you know, there's a lot more detail in it. You know, how do you adapt that to a film?
You, metaphorically, you smash it on the ground and you pick up certain pieces.
Right.
And then you put it together in a structure that makes sense to film. So the novel, for example...
You've never had any experience doing that.
And I failed and I failed and I failed until I got it right. So, but my experience in film, which is a very simplistic way of seeing it, is I just loved film. I don't love film as much now, which is sad, because when I think back at the, you know, in the 70s, 80s and 90s, I think I would have gone to the movies every second week. I was just fanatical about film. Yeah. So in a way, I understood the structure in my head about how a film has to happen. But the hardest thing when you're the writer and when you are adapting is the first thing that goes out the window is the first person narrator. So Josie Alibrandi, as the first person narrator of the novel, she had to go out the window because how are you going to convey that? We did it with voiceover, which was difficult in a way, but you have to make sure that you're allowing visuals to tell the story, you're allowing the dialogue to really shine, but also structurally. And thank goodness we did this. But in the novel, there's a tomato making day, you know, making the sugo. And so we bookended the film that way, because what a vibrant, passionate way of starting a story, you know. So I just knew that the film would begin and end in the same place, but we had to make sure that we could see her journey. And I had to let go of so much in the novel. And I don't mean just cutting like that. It's, okay, you know, what works for this story on screen? And at one stage, you know, all the people that would read it, as in the people who were financing it, would say, well, we don't like this. And the same person would say, another person would say, we love it, but we don't like this. And you're dealing with that. Yeah. But there were too many girls in the story, for example. So I had to get rid of 2 or 3 girls at school. At one stage, one of the main characters, who something dramatic happens to, John Barton, they told me to take him out of the story, because in the novel, I'm going to have to say this after 30 years, he dies. Too bad if you haven't read the book. But in the novel, he dies at the end. And they said, we don't want people walking out of a movie theatre crying. So, you know, take him out. And I thought, well, he's crucial, to the story. Yeah. So what I structurally did was I placed his death in the middle of the story, so it becomes her journey. So I think structure is everything in film, and it's the hardest thing to learn in film. I feel as if I can do everything else but structure. Yeah. So I fail, and then I keep on failing until I get it right. Yeah. So it's really trying and trying and trying again.
Yeah. But that failing process, okay, right, you tried and you tried and you tried again. But I'm sure there's a lot of other people who have been trying and failing for a lot longer, you know, and who might have had other experiences in film that you probably didn't. So you've got to say, you know, that you're very gifted in that process. So have you done any other ones? Or was there ever a discussion of looking for Alibrandi 2?
Oh, there's always, like, I mean, there's always discussion of, you know, a production company has the rights to the series. Mm-hmm. But what we have now is the streamers, and we have to see if the streamers are interested. Yeah. So the idea could be fantastic, but you are stuck With film, you used to be stuck if you didn't get a distributor. And in television, so I have 2 works that we've been given money to develop, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. So you just put all your heart into the development of it and hope it's going to pull off. And at the moment, for example, for the first time ever, I'm working on something for Studio Canal that's not my work, that's not adapted from something that I've written as a novel. And I never thought I could do that. I always thought that I could just love the characters I created, but I love this, and I love the fact that I've been given an opportunity. And I, fingers crossed, I think it's the closest of something that is going to, be able to happen. But I love script writing and television writing as much as I love novel writing, but you're doing a lot behind the scenes, and you won't discover that it's going to be on until you hear it's on at the same time as I do, because it's just such a tricky thing. It's just...
Have you ever done comedy writing? Like for comedians or for sketches?
No, because...
Do you want to?
I don't think so, but it's interesting.
Here's me offering you a job, by the way.
No, but it's because when I remember the first time I read a scene out of Alibrandi, it was back in 1993, my mum was in the audience, and I was reading it out and people were laughing, and I was stopping because I thought, what's going on here? And then later, my mum and friends in the audience were like, they were laughing at the work. They thought it was funny. And so my humour, it's... I don't know if I can do blatant humour. Like, my humour comes through the characters. It's just, if you meet anyone in my world, like even, my 11-year-old, without even trying, she's pretty funny. I mean, I could write like I've almost written one with, the Zola books, but, the things that, she'll show me these dance moves and she takes herself so seriously. I think, oh my God, I could write this character. Or, she was singing All I Want for Christmas Is You the other day. And she said, do you think I sing it better than the girl who sings it? I mean, that's Mariah Carey, but my daughter thinks she sings it better, so, and she doesn't, trust me. But I just think that with with the people around me, the humour comes from them as characters, and then it comes through their dialogue with people. Whereas I know what you do. I've seen you perform, which is great, and I, watch it when it comes through on Instagram or whatever. Yours is also persona and personality, and I don't think I've got the personality to get up on stage, But I think that if someone said write something humorous, I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, right.
But if they said don't, it probably the humour would come through. So
okay.
I think you would know this. Comedy, I think, is the hardest. And I always wonder why, when you come, I was just looking at the, I think the Golden Globe Awards, where the nominations. I think, how comes, comedy movies don't win the big prizes as much? Because I think that the challenge is comedy. I think drama's easy. Drama is so easy.
Yeah, right. That's interesting.
So,
well, look, it is difficult, yes. But, it's like anything else. Look, I had a guy once, and this is what made me realise. He said, there's no way I'd be able to do what you do. I said, well, I've learnt it. It's a job. I know the craft. He goes, yeah, mate, no, I couldn't do what you do. I said, well, what do you do? He goes, no, nothing. I said, well, what do you do? He says, I'm working in the army. I said, yeah, and what do you do in the army? He goes, I teach people how to parachute. Right? And here's something I would never do. But for this guy here who jumps out of a plane 20 times a day, he feels that the job of the stand-up comedian is really difficult. I mean, at least in my job, if I die, I can step on stage again. If he dies in his job, he's gone for real.
I know. I've had those conversations. I remember, being at a kids' party. My daughter was invited, and I was chatting with someone. It's just lovely, and she said, "I could never do what you do. That's amazing." And then I found out that she was the head doctor of emergency at St. Vincent's. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed that I didn't ask enough questions. But how could someone think that what I do is harder than that? It's just, but I think it's always that appreciation for what other people do. And there is a difficulty in everything we do. And I think of, when you say, where do you start? I mean, when you're writing or performing a joke, or probably more when you're writing it, do you know if it doesn't work, like, what do you do with it? Do you put it away, or do you kind of workshop it until it works?
Yeah, you keep on workshopping it. I mean, I've got to be honest in saying a lot of people don't know this. I've never written a show. This is the show that you saw recently was the first show I actually got a blank piece of paper and said, let's start writing.
Yes.
I've never done that. I've just kind of winged it. Has old material, threw in some new, threw out the old until, I had another hour. I've never actually sat down and done, and I really enjoyed the process. It was a lot easier than I thought it would be. But as I've been 27 years doing this, you know how to make something funny, or you really know how to make it funny in terms of the writing part, but also the delivery.
But also, I mean, when I think of your show, this last one, thematically, it was sustained. What you said it was going to be about was what it was going to be about, you know, about respect and the whole thing. I felt sorry the kid in front of me was the youngest in the audience. And you could always tell the kid who's probably thinking, don't ask me, don't talk about me.
No, the kids cop it in the show.
I know someone's child who copped it. But it's a sustained, you stuck to the theme. And I think that's the same with writing. You have to explore, whether you want to or not. You don't want to seem as if you're a school teacher about it, but if you're exploring a world, you have to sustain that. You have to develop the characters. You can't go off in all different directions. And it's a discipline. And I have to say that I feel very disciplined. And I felt that as soon as I quit full-time work, and I realised, and that was back in 2006, where I realised I have to make a living out of this. I've made a big statement of quitting 10 years of teaching, where I, regardless of how bad the income was, I received an income every week, and all of a sudden you've got to make this work. And at the beginning of every year or financial year, I think, oh gosh, I have to make this work.
Yeah.
But it's happened for, 15 years. I've managed to, work at it. So it doesn't come easy, but it is something that you have to have a passion for, and you have to have that talent, but you also have to have that perseverance.
Yeah.
Because imagine if we quit every time, someone heckled you or someone rejected my manuscript, you know.
Well, that's what I always say to young comedians. If you can get up there and you can do even 5 minutes, out of that 5 minutes you get 1 minute of laughter or a few gags that get laughs, you've got it. You've got something there. You're just going to have to refine that now, And going back to, so looking for Alibrandi, both the novel and the film won a plethora of awards. Okay. What happens after that?
What happens after that is I don't write something else for another 11 years.
Right. Why?
Well, because probably the film writing happened in between, and there was a lot of writing. So, sometimes people say, oh, you didn't do that much between the books. And I think, well, I did. I taught and I wrote a film script, which took years and years. I mean, you do one draft, you do another, you wait forever for someone to give you feedback. It goes like that. Then you have to wait for funding. But when I think of the novels, it's 11 years between the first and the second novel. And with the second novel, I did...
Which was called?
Saving Francesca.
Yep.
And it's set she lives probably a couple of streets away from here.
Yeah.
And so once again, it was an inner west school, or inner west world. She goes to school in the city. But it was one of those stories where once again I wrote what I knew, and I was teaching at an all-boys school, and I was probably one of 15 or 20 women, and so I ended up writing about what seemed as if it was a girl going to a boys' school in year 11 and 12, but really it was a story about her dealing with her mother's depression. Her mother, who's really dynamic, who's really kind of switched on. She's a university lecturer. They're Italian family, but that next generation of, Australian born. And that just, it just came out of me once again, in a way that was so similar to Alibrandi that it was just such a personal, I don't know, there's just so much in there that belongs to my family story. And my mother's always okay about me talking about it because she's the most dynamic 82-year-old. But it happened to me as a child, where your very dynamic mother is kind of, everyone's whispering around you and you end up living with your nonna or your auntie and no one's telling you anything. And I remember when she read the manuscript, she said, I don't mind that you wrote about it. I just mind that this has lived with you all these years.
Wow.
And I thought, of course it's lived with me. But also, I'm a writer. Of course I'm going to take advantage of that, Yeah. And that was the biggest surprise, that the reaction to that novel was a biggest surprise, because in the way that Alibrandi lifted the lid on, culture and racism, this just seemed to really open the door to discussions about, depression. And that was back in 2003. And it actually got me a US agent. Like, it was one of my first novels it was the first novel that kind of, made it into the American market, and there was a bidding war on the manuscript. And I remember this is such an important story for me about who we are here in, say, the the inner West, or in Australia, that I went to New York because they wanted to fly me in and out in a week. And I went to New York, Cincinnati, of all places, Seattle, Chicago, and then San Francisco, a night each, right?
Yeah.
And I was in New York and I read a scene out loud, and someone came up to me and they said, "Oh my God, it was so strange listening to Francesca with an Australian accent."
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, she's Australian." And I told that story in Chicago, and someone came up, because I thought it was funny, that someone would think that this character was American. And someone came up to me and she said, "Oh, Francesca's a Chicago girl." And it was the first time I realised that this girl from the inner West, all of us, that we belong on a world stage.
Absolutely.
That it's a small book, but it's about big issues. I mean, depression and, dealing with being a minority and all of those things. And as I said, it got me an agent in the States, and I've been published there ever since. So it's those small kind of moves that you make. And I was worried because I thought, here I am writing about a similar world, but to me they were two different stories, and that ended up winning quite a lot of awards as well. So, just kind of, I'm glad she came to me. There are always characters that come to me, so I'm glad Francesca came to me.
Well, yeah, I want to speak to you about the awards, because you've won quite a lot of awards. When you look at your bio and what you've done, and you won Children's Book of the Year twice.
For
right?
Alibrandi and Francesca.
Yeah. And so what other awards have you won that have really, changed your career in terms of the amount of, like you said, the agents that came to you, but also in terms of where your direction was heading?
Well, I think the third novel, On the Jellicoe Road, which is the one that it's probably the most likely one day to be a series because of, things happening with it. It just, when it came out here, and that was 2006, it was like, well, she's not an Italian girl from the suburbs. And so the reaction here was really quite, I wouldn't say flat, but it was like people didn't know what to do with me. And I think it's a really interesting thing. And I don't know whether this happens in your, world of humour, because your humour is a lot about, being Italian.
Yeah.
But, how slapped down would you be if you tried something different? And my thing was, it wasn't something different, but it was where I wanted to be. It was what I wanted to be writing at the time. Nothing, it was kind of a mystery. It was very complex, and I don't know, but it was more than anything, it was a mystery of, two generations out in the bush, blah, 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 blah. And so it was really interesting, the reaction after, and it wasn't from the Italians, it was from kind of the literary world of, but we want you to do that again. We want you to do Alibrandi and Francesca again. So it kind of, like, I found that it was beginning to find an audience, and then all of a sudden, in 2009, it won a literary prize in the US, and that was a game changer. And once again, it really reinforced that reputation that I had in the US. They call my work there literary YA, whereas here it's just, YA, but it's, they just kind of put in a particular category. But it certainly reinforced my reputation there and here. I'm very stubborn. I don't like being put into, it's not that I don't want to be put here, it's that I just want to try all these different things. I want to try, fantasy. And by the time I wrote the fantasy novel, where everyone said, "Oh, whoa, that's so far away from what you have done," I think, no, it isn't. Because if you look at my first fantasy novel, which is Finnegan of the Rock, it has all the same themes as Looking for Alibrandi. It's about loss of homeland. It's about being raised by people who romanticize, we used to call it Saint Italy, It's the language that I used, when you're creating a fantasy world, I thought, well, what do I call characters? And so I just kind of used Italian names like, the head of the mountains or the Mons was Saro. Like everyone thought it was an exotic name, but it was my uncle's name, because he's Ross.
Yeah.
The matriarch was Serenonna. It was just all these things that, when I think of, the goddesses, Lagrimi, Sagrami, I was just using my Italian, and I was using the stories, and I was still using a character like Josie who does not share the same language as, the next generation, because they've been locked out of their homeland. So it's all of these different things. So you're still doing what you want to do, but kind of on your own terms in a way. And that's what I try to do with my writing.
Yeah. So just speaking about that, because that's really interesting. So when you wrote Looking for Alibrandi, you drew a lot from your own experiences. Where do you go to write a fantasy novel?
So with Finnegan, I was actually in New York. It was 2006. I was in New York.
Were you living there? Or
No, I was only there for 8 weeks. I did a swap with a writer who, lived there with her husband. So she took my place. I was living in Surrey Hills at the time. She lived in my place. I lived in, her place in the East Village. And a whole bunch of friends, my sister came over. But I was living in the home, in the apartment of someone who writes fantasy. But I just remember this. I remember sitting, first of all, it's a walking village. So it's a walking city, New York. So I felt as if I walked 10 years of teaching boys out of my head, because those boys' voices just dominated. And the moment I walked them out of my head, I remember sitting in a train, and there was a poster in front of me that was just of a refugee camp in Africa. And I remember everyone around me was speaking a different language. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting that there are so many of us who aren't in their place of birth at the moment. And all of a sudden, this character, it was almost like tap, tap, tap. By the way, that's me. My name's Finnegan, And I remember that night, because I just started conjuring all this stuff up. And I remember that night writing an email to my publisher saying, do you think I could write fantasy, especially after, you've written Alibrandi and On the Jellicoe Road and Francesca. And I remember the next day getting the email in capitals, of course you can. And so that was an incentive, but also I had got asked, I don't know what it was about now when I think about it, but I was asked to go to Italy in April the next year to speak at something. It was in Torino. And so I thought, you know what, while I'm there, why don't I just do a bit of research of medieval kind of, and that's how it started. It started with landscape.
Right.
And I remember someone there who was taking me around saying that she felt that, the stone of the houses, that it was in her kind of soul. And I just remember thinking, wow, I just really love that. So I did a lot of research there, but that was only in the early days of writing it. And so I would have, in the next couple of years, I would have done a couple of trips for the different books. And I went to Basilicata, which is in the middle of Italy, to Matera, where everyone used to live in caves.
Yeah.
So anywhere where there was a cave dwelling, that's where I was crawling through. And you kind of have to have a feel of it. You have to smell it to be able to bring it to life, because I'm not good at descriptive language. I'm really good at dialogue. So I had to really see it to be able to write about it. And I loved it. Like, I just loved that research so much. I kind of romanticized that time in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting, you go from the fantasy, then you go to the children's books. Now, you've written for teenagers and you've also written for 5 to 7 year olds. So explain the difference between those to kind of writing for those, those age brackets.
Well, teenagers and adults are the same for me, because I don't think of audience. I don't think this is for a teenager. I think this is for someone my age. So it's really rare that I have to change anything because it's considered for, young adults if I'm writing an adult novel. But with kids, they're not going to understand sarcasm.
Yeah.
They're not going to understand, you can't be rude. You can't say shut up or, F off or anything. So to me, it's the hardest. When I think of poetry is hard. Script writing is hard because it's fewer words. And even worse is writing for children because it's fewer words, but it has to pack a punch. And I feel awful about this because I started writing those little books. I wrote them for my daughter.
The Zola series?
The Zola series. I wrote them because I had been asked by my editor, and stupidly I called it, what Zola did on Monday, not realising I had to write another, 6 books. I wish I had said what Zola did on the weekend. But they saved me during COVID. I wrote those during COVID. But also I was very conscious about how many gaps on the page for a child like my daughter, who's a very reluctant and struggled a bit in the classroom. I also knew what it was like for a parent to have to listen to them reading for so long. So I kept the chapters short so they could have a win. But more than anything, and this is why I don't feel guilty, but it's awful in a way, that my father was still alive, and I wrote about this little girl living with her mum and her nonna, and they were kind of grieving the father, and I didn't realise that, within 6 months my father would have passed away. And I wonder if deep down I sensed it. But it is, as fun as that series is, and of course it's got naughty dogs in it and Zola's naughty, it is the grandfather or the nonno is in every story. The memory of him, even now there's a picture book out, a Christmas one, and it's called Zola and the Christmas Lights, and it's just beautiful. But it was about the year, like my mother would not have the Christmas lights up, because he died in October, and they were massive with the Christmas lights. Yeah. They were the nativity scene and the whole thing.
Because she felt that, she still had to mourn him.
She was just heartbroken. She was just heartbroken. My father, it happened quick in a way.
Right.
And so the next year I remember she was crying because everyone else was putting up their, decorations. And theirs were really hardcore. I mean, we're talking about the nativity scenes and whatever. And my brother-in-law and nephews came over and did them. So really the Zola books are always about incidences in our lives. My father had this little boat that he was always going to fix up and sail away. And of course he didn't. And it was there after he died. So in the Zola Friday book, they do up this boat. So their books for my daughter and my younger nephew, there's 4 grandchildren, but they're the younger ones, because those stories are connected to my dad, and I wanted them to remember my dad in a way that my older nephews will never forget him. He was so much part of their lives. So I wrote about our world. I changed a few names around. I wrote about the neighbourhood we were living in, at that time, and they were such important people in our lives. And I think that authenticity has made them so beautifully received, I think, because, and plus they've helped a lot of, struggling kids read.
Yeah, yeah. Well, whilst on that point, if... if there are parents listening or watching this who really want their kids to read, or whose kids are struggling to read or just not interested, what would your advice be to them in a nutshell?
In a nutshell. Well, my daughter is, be a tyrant, be like me. I force my daughter to read every day, and she doesn't want to, but she enjoys it. I know she enjoys it. And when someone says my child's not a reader, I want to say yet. They're not a reader yet. So you've got to push that at this time in their life, because they'll always need it to do with literacy. But one day when they're 15, they might pick up that book. They might pick up Alibrandi. The amount of times that people said it was the first book I ever read. I don't know how that happened at the age of 16, but it was the first book, and they started reading from then on. Yeah. But also, I could talk about this on a whole new podcast about the relationship between, when I think of all the young people in their depression now, I've flirted with depression all my life, but I had books to escape in, and they don't have that to escape in. It's no use getting rid of, phones, whatever. They're here to stay, but you don't get that same kind of thrill, going through your phone. Whereas I think we owe it to our kids to push that reading, because they will need it one day. They will need that escapism. So, my thing is that she's not allowed to watch TV, and she's desperate to do all of those things until, she reads. We call it drop everything and read, because that's what it used to be called at school. Yep. And that's how we, get through books. Yeah. And she does get through them, and she reads for her age, which is great. Yeah. So,
well, you've given us a little insight into how things have changed there. As a writer, how have you had to adapt to writing, back then to writing for kids now?
I know how to edit myself a lot more than, it's the same with you and your work. You know how to fix things.
Yeah.
So now when I'm writing for kids, less is more. I have to, when you write something for a child, you overwrite. You could write 2,000 words or 2,500 words, and you know that you have to get it down to 1,500. So it's about picking and choosing. It's about really knowing your audience in a way that I didn't really care about who was reading the other books, because I was writing them for myself. But with a kid's book, you are writing for an audience, and you're writing for kids who are struggling at that age, whether they're great readers or not. The great readers get the good storyline. I mean, they're fun storylines. But the kid who's struggling, they just get to, I know what on a page will make a kid feel great about turning that page. And that's how, I suppose for me, I was that kid. I was that kid who had a mum who took an interest. And for me, that's what I'm doing for my child or kids in general. And even, I work 2 days a week in a library. And every time I toss up whether I should be doing that because I've got so much work, first of all, it keeps me sane to be in an environment. But at this point in my life, I just think I just want to push reading. Reading, I think, is not just about literacy, and it's not just about English. It's just about so much more. And I want everyone reading.
Yeah. You mentioned that you worked in the library. It's interesting because looking for Alibrandi, I think it was classified as the book that was the most stolen out of libraries. I'm very conscious of time. We could talk for a lot longer than this, but I've got a couple more questions. So firstly, I want to ask your opinion, and you may say to me, Joe, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to have my opinion, on the record. Looking for Alibrandi was, such a great success. What are your thoughts on? Okay, and obviously it had really helped people with an ethnic background for identity. There are other movies like that which have become really successful as well, but not, that haven't been lauded by the critics. What are your thoughts on that?
The films that are out there now.
Yeah.
Give me an example. What
Wog
film?
Boys.
Do you think it has to be lauded by the critics?
No, it probably hasn't. What are your thoughts on your work and that kind of work? Look, and and what it does for the ethnic, the identity, because it does.
I think it's important. I think it's very important because I think that I was lucky because my work was accepted by both sides.
Yeah.
And I think if we're going to call it ethnic humour, sometimes it's just accepted by kind of the people it's directed to.
Yeah.
I just think that anything out there that is exploring other cultures, apart from the dominant ones, are very important because what it's going to do, it's going to trigger off. Some kid's going to be sitting, or some person, not a kid, is going to be sitting in the audience watching it, whether it's great or not, and thinking, I can do that, and they can do it even better. So I think that, like for me, I've loved it when someone, I know people who are, Muslim writers or Asian writers who have said that they wrote because they read Looking for Alibrandi and thought, if she can do it about her culture, we can do it about ours. Yeah. So I think it's really important. Look, I think of something like Wogs, not Wog Boys, but Wogs Out of Work. Mm-hmm. I will never, ever forget seeing that for the first time, ever. I was at Enmore Theatre, and I remember my stomach ached. I laughed so much. I had never in my life seen it, heard it, and it was like, oh my God, like this isn't just happening in our houses. This isn't just happening, with your friends. Mm. So it was just this idea of we exist, the other. I have this passion for the other, whether it is a cultural one, whether it's a sexual one, whatever, but we need to make a place for them to tell their stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if it's not being loved by the critics, who cares? Keep on doing it until, because sometimes what happens is the critics discover it, love it, and they think they found it. It's always been there. But I just think there's a place for it. There has to be a place for
Yeah.
it because it is tied into
Yeah,
identity.
yeah. I'm glad that you got that opinion because I think the same thing. And I mean, I've been in a movie theater where um, the whole audience has laughed at the movie, but then and I knew that there was a reviewer in that same room because it was the opening night, and then I saw the review in the paper, and we gave them a 1 star.
Yeah.
Yet they didn't take into consideration. Okay, well, maybe I didn't like it. Maybe critically, compared to other films, it wasn't the best. But they completely disregarded the fact that the whole room was laughing. So it must have touched on something, and that's I think what those films have done, and it's a great thing.
Oh, of course it is. And I think also when a reviewer reviews something, they come in with their own agenda, They come in with a big agenda, and it could be putting people in their place. It could have a racist agenda.
Yeah.
They could be very highbrow. Why was that person reviewing
Yeah.
in that case? I mean, I got it a lot with, there were negative reviews of Alibrandi. And you just thought, and sometimes you get negative reviews or negative feedback from people within the culture because it's almost like that wasn't my experience.
Yeah.
And I don't want us to be dumbed down. And, but I just think that if it's out there, what it's saying to everyone is there is a place for a story that doesn't just belong to the dominant culture. And I personally do not think, if I had to be critical about anything, Alibrandi, the film, came out in 2000. No, I do not think that we have come a long way when it comes to the representation of other cultures. Maybe in the last, year or two. But no, I just think that was the first film of the year 2000, and I think that it should have generated a lot more interest in telling other stories.
Yeah.
And I think that we still belong to a very, very, very kind of one culture nation storytelling. Thankfully now, Indigenous storytelling has really, really taken off. But I still feel as if we are seeing the world of our country through one lens. And I think that has to change.
Yeah, cool. All right, 2 more questions. What's next? What's happening now?
Oh, what's happening now? So I'm writing this, I'm finishing this script for Studio Canal, and I am, and I'm writing the pilot episode and the second episode of a series with my fingers crossed.
Okay.
But the good thing about that is, even though whether we know where it's going or not, we've got money to develop it, and it means that whatever we come out with, which I think will be great, we've got it to take to other places.
Yeah.
But you just don't give in. If you really believe in a story, and I believe that there's a place for these stories, I miss a character knocking at my brain. But I've lived 2 years with my mum, not that there's, no place for that. I haven't been in my own space. I mean, we are kind of in our own space now. COVID, I think a lot of things affect your storytelling. I haven't travelled for, my passport's expired, which is so rare for me.
Have you got an Italian passport?
No, my father was an Australian citizen before I was born.
Yeah.
We were very angry at him about that. So, yeah, it's just, I miss writing a novel, but I just think, I just wait. I've learnt in the 30 years that I don't get left alone too long, so I'm just waiting.
Yeah. And my last question is this: what do you do every day to live your most creative life? How do you keep those creative juices flowing?
I go every morning to get a coffee and I walk home. But I try to do this. I write every day, because what happens is the next day you go to your writing and you get rid of 80% of it because it's crap. But there's a piece of gold there that you can kind of go, okay, I'm going to take it from there. So it's that. It's the child. I mean, I have to say, it's people. I think, I don't say this flippantly, I get told the most intense stories or situations in the Coles aisles. Yeah. It's people. And I think that that's what we missed about, with COVID just not seeing the world. But I think it's just, I love people and I love their stories. And sometimes their stories seem really kind of got nothing to do with what you want to do. And then all of a sudden I think, oh my God, like I loved the I don't know, I loved what came out of that, or I love what it said about someone's personality, so I might adopt part of that to tell. So it's just hanging out at Coles. No, it's not that, but it's just the interaction with my world. And it's, I love the inner west, so I feel as if there's so much here.
It's a great part of the
It
world.
is, it is.
Melina Marchetti, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you.